Among the oldest entries found in the sealed Libraria of the Order Hereticus is a communication thread dating back to Millennia 32. The transcript, partially redacted, outlines a series of disputes between Arbites Justicars and inquisitorial agents during a mass sedition purge on Bion Secundus. The primary issue was jurisdiction. The Arbites demanded a trial for a rogue cardinal under Lex Imperialis. The Inquisition had already passed sentence under inquisitorial mandatum. The records confirm both sides ignored the other's ruling. The cardinal was executed twice. This integration has had multiple consequences. Administratum delays in audit verification decreased by 19% in affected sectors. Mechanicus dispute escalation cases were down by nearly 12% across the same range. Imperial review documents attribute these changes directly to preemptive oversight by Arbites legal analysts, whose presence deterred manipulation and falsification before it could take root. While controversial in fringe systems, central worlds now view the Arbites not just as enforcers, but as regulatory architecture in a galaxy where disorder is always growing. Inquisition records regarding the Adeptus Arbites are markedly more selective, filtered through a veil of necessity, distrust, and reluctant respect. While administratum archives overflow with statistical reviews and procedural timelines, inquisitorial documentation instead pivots toward confrontation, focusing less on the Arbites enforcement efficiency and more on their potential liability to broader imperial interests. Perhaps the clearest reflection of this expanded role can be found in the Far Sector reclassification orders, an administratum-led effort to reorganize failing sectors into manageable legal blocks. The Arbites were assigned to enforce the necessary regime collapses. Instead of simply deploying force, they acted as legal engines, drafting emergency governance templates, issuing jurisdiction reassignment orders, and overseeing tribunal trials from orbit. In many cases, Arbites enforcement ensured that administratum reforms were not only enacted, but believed. According to suppressed case logs recovered from the Ordo Scriptorum, several such incidents occurred during the Sarric uprisings in the early 35th millennia. In these cases, Arbites data scribes logged planetary irregularities that coincided directly with the covert repositioning of inquisitorial strike teams. The Inquisition responded by forcibly seizing the precinct archives and purging all scribes involved. The Adeptus Arbites filed no complaints. They had by that point learned the boundary line. However, these cooperative examples are rarer than the reverse. Most inquisitorial references to the Arbites contain language such as limited flexibility, data hazard, or bureaucratic entanglement. In Order Malleus records concerning demon incursions, Arbites precincts are frequently flagged as containment liabilities. Their insistence on procedural lockdowns, full case documentation, and local judiciary hearings often compromises speed-critical purges. Inquisitor Valter Nureyev, in a sealed record dated Millennia 40, year 102, described the Arbites as a door that must be locked before entry, even when the house is burning. His remarks followed a failed purge in which Arbites forces detained psycho witnesses scheduled for Inquisition extraction. By the time Ordo operatives retrieved them, demonic corruption had already set in. Inquisition forces raided the archive and destroyed the device. All surviving Arbites judges who used it were deemed irreparably compromised and summarily executed. No procedural reforms were issued by the Arbites hierarchy. Instead, the incident was dismissed internally as external data corruption. This pattern of structural denial in the face of metaphysical error is noted repeatedly throughout Inquisition observation files. A suppressed Ordo Hereticus transcript retrieved from the sealed investigation vaults of the Conclave Viras indicates the Adeptus Arbites once stood directly in the path of an active chaos infiltration, not out of courage, but out of procedural obstruction. The incident, logged under the cryptonym Trial of Sanctum Serratus, involved a sprawling heretical cult embedded within the lower tiers of a hive city on Hesper Fifths. The Inquisition had confirmed the cult spread through auto-hymn subversions and black market scripture, traced directly to several administratum enclaves. However, before the Ordo's kill teams could intervene, the Arbites launched a full lockdown, citing improper data routing in tithe flow and ecclesiastical budget falsification. This event is not isolated. In Order Malleus Black Vault records, several Arbites units have been directly responsible for the loss of critical operations due to procedural rigidity. The Charn system confession loop, uncovered in the mid-millennia 40 era, involved a looped cogitator confession device installed within a remote Arbites satellite courthouse. The Inquisition found the lie convenient and let it stand, but internally the Ordo Xenos Codex analysis warned, the Arbites do not lie, but they believe lies when those lies come with proper documentation. What followed was a 3-week impasse. The Arbites demanded full Lex file authentication for the Ordo's entry. The Inquisition refused, invoking mandatum ultimae. During this bureaucratic standoff, the cult detonated a warp breach device, opening a stable tear within the city's central chapel. Arbites forces, trained only in standard riot doctrine, responded with shield walls and stun projectors. The death toll reached over 80,000 before exterminatus-level inquisitorial response concluded the crisis. The sealed post-mortem report labelled Red Inquiry 445 listed the Arbites not as co-conspirators, but as insufficiently adaptive to the metaphysical scope of threat. The fortress precinct involved was dissolved, and no further documentation exists on the fate of its officers. The Inquisition continues to utilise Arbites forces as needed, but always with caution. They are not trusted. They are not included in long-term contingency planning unless absolutely required. They are a scalpel, effective only when the wound is linear, and when the infection spreads across dimensions, ideologies, and timelines. The Inquisition prefers tools with discretion, not justice. Inquisition officials terminated the initiative, citing gross metaphysical overreach. The Marshal was executed, and his name removed from all Arbites honor rolls. The surviving records describe the event as a perfect example of legal logic collapsing under temporal distortion, a concept completely outside the Arbites understanding. Law does not bend toward time. Arbites thinking cannot. The device, originally used to extract testimony under duress, had been compromised by a demon of Tzeentch and restructured to imprint false guilt and ideological corruption through auditory subroutine. Arbites judges began issuing mass executions based on confessions to crimes that never occurred. At its peak, the device had logged over 65,000 false confessions across 23 planetary outposts. The anomaly was only discovered after an Ordo Malleus Psycho Squad noticed identical phrases in confession transcripts taken light years apart. The Inquisition marked the operation as a success, but in private annotations the presiding Inquisitor wrote, "We cannot judge them by sanity. Sanity is a curve. Law is a line." Yet not all interactions between these institutions end in failure or co-optation. A lesser-known case, recorded as Ordo Mechanicus Shadow File 998 Delta, shows the Arbites acting against their own interests to support an Inquisition operation. The file details a long-term infiltration of a Mechanicus Noospheric relay station used to transmit false cogitator doctrine. When Inquisitors attempted to disable the station, they found themselves blocked by Mechanicus Command. The local Arbites precinct, discovering the relay's data feed violated encoded public Lex propagation, invoked Lex Veritas Clause 11, normally used for censoring Multec propaganda. In the sealed Ordo Xenos record labelled Midnight Mandate, the Arbites were deployed alongside inquisitorial agents during a containment effort on the world of Palatus Hive, an agri-industrial centre where non-human Xenos had been found genetically modifying local food stock into spore-based biocoding. Arbites forces, unaware of the Xenos' presence, focused solely on a local factory syndicate suspected of falsifying quotas. Inquisitors on the ground used the Arbites' public enforcement activity as cover, purging over 100 Xenos hybrids without ever notifying the judges. After the campaign concluded, a full Arbites report was submitted to Segmentum Command, stating that systemic criminality within the grain sector had been neutralized through legal procedure. Even in cases involving direct exposure to warp forces, Arbites agents have been documented retaining partial functional integrity. One analysis from the Order Malleus Black Crypt, encoded as Voxful Suppression Report, details an Arbites execution team tasked with neutralizing a rogue astropath's cult. The cult had been amplifying distress signals through a psychic beacon tied to ancient Xenos tech. Arbites stormed the Enclave, killed all occupants, and catalogued the structure using standard Lex audit procedures, never realizing the walls were carved with language that actively destabilized cognitive patterns. After review, only one of the 6 Arbites scribes showed signs of influence. The rest were declared mentally intact, though utterly incapable of recognizing what had occurred. The Inquisition concluded they had law-filtered the anomaly. Their inability to process non-procedural concepts had shielded them from the psychic contagion. They could not be corrupted by patterns they could not recognize as real. From the Inquisition's perspective, the Adeptus Arbites function like a stone thrown into a sea of shifting threats. They do not adapt, they do not learn, but they endure. Their usefulness lies not in comprehension, but in resistance through ignorance. They serve as a psychological firewall, capable of performing their duties in environments where perception itself bends. Inquisitorial field manuals refer to this phenomenon as cognitive anchoring, where individuals rooted in unyielding mental frameworks are harder to shift or destabilize. The most infamous example is the incident referred to in Inquisition shadow logs as the Gavel Rain. This occurred on the shrine world of Cyranthus, which had been cut off from Segmentum Command for over 180 years. During that time, the Arbites Precinct Fortress continued to enforce law with absolute procedural purity. However, without external correction or updated data feeds, the local Lex index began to self-iterate. This gave the Arbites temporary legal right to override Mechanicus' sovereignty in the sector. The Inquisition stepped in during the resulting administrative collapse, terminated the Xenos' altered core, and disappeared before the Mechanicus could reassert control. Arbites officials issued a formal statement citing non-compliant algorithmic syntax. They were never told the truth, but in that moment, their rigid devotion to the law aligned perfectly with the Inquisition's broader war against the unseen. This philosophical rigidity is both the Arbites' armor and their most dangerous flaw. In multiple Ordo reports, Arbites are compared to servitorized law code, tireless, absolute, unthinking, except within the strict limits of their instruction set. This has benefits. During the Syndraxia Purge, Arbites held an entire hive city under lockdown for 3 years without reinforcement, refusing to relinquish command to local governors or military elements, even after their own food reserves had failed. Inquisitors sent to the city found half-dead judges still patrolling courthouses, writing citations on corpses. Their psychological profiles showed no signs of madness, only dedication. Over time, the Arbites reclassified behavioral categories, reinterpreted ancient case law, and developed new classes of crime based on linguistic drift in old Vox mandates. By the time Inquisition operatives re-established contact, the Arbites had created an independent judicial theocracy. They had not declared independence, they had not rebelled, they simply believed their system was still imperial. The Inquisition response was total. The fortress was breached, records confiscated, and all judges executed. Their final words, recorded by Ordo Hereticus agents, were, "We obey the voice of the law. If that voice has changed, it is not we who are heretic." Despite these risks, the Inquisition still uses the Arbites across nearly every Ordo campaign. Not because they are perfect, not because they understand, but because they will act. When deployed against a threat within their jurisdiction, Arbites forces respond with precision and finality. They do not hesitate, they do not negotiate, and in a galaxy where hesitation opens doors to heresy, that alone makes them irreplaceable. Inquisitor Caldrake Thorn, an Ordo Xenos agent with over 400 logged planetary purges, once remarked in a private communique, "The Arbites are not allies. They are not pawns. They are levers. Pull the correct one, and the machine of law crushes all beneath it. Pull the wrong one, and the machine crushes you. Because law, even when blind, still strikes, and in the Imperium of man, striking is often enough. The final entry in the Ordo's secret evaluation files closes with this sentence: "Let the Arbites be flawed, let them be blind, let them be used, but let them never stop." It is not paranoia, it is pattern recognition. The Adeptus Arbites are essential, but in the Inquisition's calculus, essential does not mean permanent. The law must be preserved, yes, but if it cannot bend, then it must break, and when it does, someone must be there to sweep away the pieces before they embed too deeply in the flesh of the Imperium. These scenarios are not predictions, they are contingencies. The Inquisition maintains active watchlists of Arbites precincts showing signs of lexical drift, prolonged operational isolation, or anomalous theological rulings. In most cases, subtle corrective action is taken: a reassignment, a review, a quiet erasure of a senior judge. In extreme cases, the entire fortress is silenced. The operation is never logged. The law, after all, cannot be seen to falter, especially by those who carry its hammer. Several suppressed theoretical projections suggest that, under prolonged warp exposure and socio-political decay, the Arbites as an institution could evolve into a caste entirely detached from the Imperium's intent, still enforcing, still documenting, but no longer connected to the soul of the Emperor's vision. The Tertius Lex collapse simulation, conducted by the Ordo Chronos in conjunction with the Scholastica Psychona, proposed that in a galaxy cut off from Terra, the Arbites could eventually declare the Lex Imperialis itself as the only divine presence, supplanting the Emperor in all but name. Not through heresy, but through perfect obedience carried to its endpoint. The spread of the Adeptus Arbites across the galaxy followed the patterns of imperial colonization and administration. As worlds were brought into compliance during the Great Crusade, the first Arbites contingents were deployed alongside Adeptus Administratum delegations. Their purpose was not to lead offensives but to assess legal structures, identify resistance to imperial edicts, and determine whether local governance posed any future threat to compliance. The role of the Adeptus Arbites extends even into civil war and large-scale conflict. During the Age of Apostasy, several Arbites precincts were instrumental in maintaining imperial cohesion by refusing to follow orders from rogue ecclesiarchs. In contrast, during the War of the Beast, many Arbites detachments were rendered obsolete due to the sheer scale of the Xenos invasion, leading to severe casualties. Despite this, they continued to enforce legal compliance where possible, often remaining on devastated worlds long after primary military forces had withdrawn. These instances highlight a critical function of the Arbites. They do not leave when battles end. They remain to ensure that what follows is compliant. On rare occasions, the Inquisition has judged Arbites personnel themselves as threats to the Imperium. These cases are heavily redacted and classified under high security clearance, but fragments survive, often embedded in internal Ordo Hereticus memos or fragmented tribunal statements. One such case, designated Exversio Lex, involved a precinct fortress on the fringes of Segmentum Obscurus, which reportedly declared its independence from Segmentum Command following a warp isolation incident. In the decades following the heresy, as imperial control sought to re-establish itself across a fractured empire, the Arbites became essential not only for enforcing loyalty, but for restoring systemic order. The Administratum archives of Millennia 31 through 32 contain a flood of sector-level audit reports initiated by the Arbites across hundreds of worlds. One of the most significant among these was the Galadric's Adherence Protocol, a multi-world campaign in the Antor subsector. This blind spot is considered both an asset and a liability. Arbites units can maintain cover, suppress panic, and move swiftly through Imperial infrastructure. But when confronted with phenomena that cannot be reduced to legally encoded behavior, such as warp contamination, psychic residue, or Xenos meme patterns, they remain procedurally paralyzed. One infamous case from Segmentum Pacificus, codenamed Glass Edict, involved a high-ranking Arbites Lord Marshal who began applying law against predictive offences after a sanctioned inquisitorial psyker revealed future violations during interrogation. The marshal attempted to revise local code to incorporate pre-crime rulings and declared over 400 future convicts guilty before any acts were committed. The Arbites officers within maintained strict enforcement of local law, but rejected updated tithing orders and refused to acknowledge inquisitorial oversight. A specialized kill team from the Ordo Hereticus was dispatched. What they found remains partially sealed, but the final summary marked the entire precinct as legally intact, ideologically divergent. The fortress was purged. The Arbites who remained loyal were executed alongside the corrupted ones, because loyalty in this case meant loyalty to the wrong standard. Within Inquisition halls, many operatives privately admit to a certain respect for the Arbites, even as they file redacted kill orders or erase records of their failures. It is not affection. It is the recognition of a tool so finely sharpened that even in misuse it draws blood. No Inquisitor would ever admit this publicly, but several field memoirs contain veiled admissions that when the warp storms rise, when the psyker screams, when the Xeno's infiltrator whispers its final lie, there is comfort in hearing the distant stomp of steel boots, the thud of a shield, and the cold, clear voice of a judge announcing that sentence is passed. The Arbites deployed 5 judgment barges to Veltraxian space, initiating what became known as the Reckoning of Names. Over 800 administrators were executed for census manipulation. A population remapping campaign was instituted using Mechanicus survey drones, with Arbites officers stationed at every data checkpoint to ensure compliance. Final Administratum review documents labelled the incident a restoration of statistical faith, a rare phrase used to denote cases where Imperial systems had been internally stabilised without outside military force. According to logged dispatches recovered and reviewed post-Indomitus, over 217 known worlds were subject to full Arbites intervention under these autonomous conditions. In each case, Arbites officers suspended all local governance and initiated legal triage, prioritising systems essential to the Mechanicus supply chain or those hosting dormant Titan legions. Administratum personnel caught falsifying priority classifications were tried on site. Mechanicus archives confirm that Arbites-led restorations resulted in the recovery of 9 dormant forge fanes across the northern edge of Segmentum Solar, including the partial reactivation of the power grid on Vorex Ultima. Still, there are limits. One Order Hereticus projection, known as Lex Collapse Scenario 92, theorizes a future where the Arbites, cut off from Terra and exposed to long-term warp phenomena, develop a closed-loop jurisprudence based entirely on broken data. In this model, they become not servants of the Emperor's law, but protectors of a corrupted archive, executing innocents in the name of laws that no longer correspond to reality. The scenario ends with an Inquisitor's comment: "When order becomes madness, the hammer must fall on the hand that holds it." One inquisitorial simulation exercise, codenamed Black Spiral Drill, exposed an Arbites squad to a slow-burn Scientian info plague designed to embed false legal clauses into their databanks. The result was alarming. Over 65% of the squad enacted false rulings based on the inserted data, executing innocent civilians and failing to identify the root corruption. The test was halted and the squad sterilized. Lessons were clear. Unbreakable structure can still be reprogrammed. Not only did Radorn's officers facilitate the transfer, but they also purged all evidence from public records, refiled all death registries, and falsified an environmental disaster report to explain the mass disappearances. Inquisitorial notes refer to Radorn as a judge who understands the chain ends above his sight line. He was not rewarded. He was simply used again. By contrast, a few Arbites officers have earned inquisitorial respect for their precision and silence. One such figure, High Marshal Gaius Radorn, is noted across 3 Ordo records for his flawless compliance with classified directives. During a high-level Ordo Malleus intervention involving an uncontained warp resonance bloom, Radorn's precinct fortress was used as an execution ground for over 500 possessed Administratum personnel. In terms of individual interactions, some Arbites judges have developed reputations within inquisitorial records for excessive zeal, obstructionist behaviour, or legal purism. A file labelled Red Line, Judge Kalnos Fair, found in the Order Kronos archives, documents a series of repeated delays Fair caused during an Inquisitor's investigation into temporal anomalies on Raxar Theta. The Arbites did not participate in the purges directly, nor were they informed of the alien threat. Their duty was purely procedural: prevent anyone from entering or leaving the central data fortress. Their compliance ensured the extermination campaign unfolded without civilian knowledge. When the purge concluded, the Arbites were issued retroactive documentation justifying the lockdown as a security response to audit fraud. The system stabilized, and the Arbites resumed standard operations. The resulting campaign lasted 17 years. Arbites presence escalated from legal observation to full enforcement occupation. Over 600 administratum workers were judged and executed, including entire regional oversight boards. Forge World output linked to the region saw measurable improvement within 3 standard years. The Arbites report on the matter, filed to the Segmentum Grand Archive, cited long-standing systemic deviance under the guise of administrative normalization. The Administratum responded by integrating random Lex division audits into its standard protocol for subsector-level tithing reviews. The case remains one of the largest peacetime executions of legal personnel in documented Imperial history. In several cases, these forms were flagged and reviewed by newly commissioned Arbites units, then operating under the original title of the Lex Imperatoria. The term Adeptus Arbites would not enter official record until after the heresy, but these early forms display identical markings, personnel designations, and sigil-stamped rulings. The Ultras compliance reports, still sealed in Segmentum Solar repositories, are widely accepted as the origin point of post-unification judicial deployment. Rituals within the Arbites structure are centered on law recitation, judgment ceremonies, and silent remembrance of fallen judges. Internal divisions exist only by function: interrogators, executioners, patrol judges, and high justicars. There are no political factions, no ideological debates. All exist under the singular interpretation of Imperial law. This insularity is by design. The Adeptus Arbites are not meant to adapt, they are meant to endure. Their presence on a world is a signal. Either order is about to be restored, or the punishment for disobedience is already underway. From this first encounter, a trend emerged. The Inquisition viewed the Arbites as valuable but dangerously rigid. Their unwillingness to adapt Imperial law to exceptional circumstances often clashed with the Inquisition's situational authority. Unlike Inquisitors, who operate based on personal judgment and strategic necessity, Arbites judges must follow the Lex Imperialis without deviation. This conflict becomes particularly visible in situations where legal enforcement could obstruct inquisitorial secrecy. An Arbites precinct fortress conducting a tithe audit may inadvertently uncover and record the movements of a hidden Ordo operation. In the latter decades of Millennia 41, the Indomitus Crusade altered Arbites deployment patterns significantly. With Rabaut Guilliman's return and the re-establishment of wider Imperium-wide contact, many Arbites precincts were reintegrated into central command. Administratum reports filed during this era indicate that Arbites units were among the first Imperial organizations to restore operational consistency in fragmented sectors. While Space Marine chapters and Astra Militarum regiments focused on Xenos and Chaos threats, the Arbites worked to rebuild legal continuity, identifying breakaway regimes, reclassifying misaligned planetary designations, and facilitating full procedural audits. The education and indoctrination of an Arbites officer is designed to prevent the development of individual morality. From their earliest years in the Schola Progenium, cadets are taught to view justice not as fairness, but as alignment with law. Compassion is considered a weakness. Empathy is a liability. An Arbites officer does not question whether a judgment is deserved, they only verify whether it is lawful. This distinction is one of the most critical traits that separate the Arbites from civilian law enforcement. Where enforcers may weigh the good of a community, the Arbites are concerned only with the good of the Imperium as defined in bureaucratic documentation. Among the most closely sealed files in inquisitorial databanks are those related to the phenomenon known as juris divergence. These are not isolated errors, nor are they acts of rebellion. Juris divergence refers to the slow, systemic evolution of Arbites precincts, particularly in isolated or warp-fractured regions, into legal authorities no longer fully aligned with the Lex Imperialis, as maintained on Terra. These deviations typically begin with minor protocol shifts, often due to data loss or chronoslip-induced desynchronization. But over decades or centuries, these shifts can accumulate until the enforcement of law ceases to resemble the intended order and becomes something else entirely. Not all interactions are exploitative. In several high-threat operations, the Arbites have provided essential stability for inquisitorial actions by securing planetary infrastructure, limiting mass panic, or preventing local governments from interfering. One recorded example, logged under Ordo Xenos Codex entry Viridian Collapse, details an Arbites-led lockdown of the planetary data grid, while inquisitorial agents purged a Genestealer infiltration among regional administratum personnel. Administratum records show a sharp increase in reported sedition, bureaucratic fraud, and quota falsification across administratum outposts. Arbites detachments were deployed under Emergency Doctrine 144C, resulting in the arrest of over 170,000 functionaries. Execution rates for convicted traitors exceeded 87%. Administratum records list the campaign as a logistical success, citing improved tithe accuracy for the next 4 standard decades. The earliest documented mention of the Adeptus Arbites within the archives of the Adeptus Administratum appears during the final years of the Great Crusade, specifically the campaign for the subjugation of the Ultras cluster in Millennia 30. Imperial compliance records reveal that administratum officials had begun filing planetary law assessments alongside standard tithing forms. The ethical codes of the Adeptus Arbites are not shaped by religion or philosophy. They follow no higher calling beyond their legal mandate. Even their few devotional practices are tied to law itself. Many precincts feature judgment chambers, rooms where Arbites officers recite legal passages, meditate on the structure of the Lex Imperialis, or review ancient case law. These rituals are not spiritual but cognitive, methods of reinforcing memory and obedience. Internal promotions require memorization of legal treatises and successful demonstration of doctrinal application in simulated scenarios. There is no allowance for creativity, and emotional reactions to legal decisions are discouraged at every level. By the middle of Millennia 34, the Adeptus Mechanicus began formally cataloguing Arbites presence during technological audits. On the Forge world of Mecan 5, a planetary blackout prompted a noospheric investigation into potential sabotage. When Mechanicus agents discovered falsified maintenance records and unauthorized access to a data vault, they initiated a request for legal verification. The presence of a full Arbites force on a world is an ominous sign. It suggests that imperial faith in local governance has eroded. In such cases, entire planetary governments may be declared illegitimate. Trials are conducted with efficiency, sometimes bypassing procedural norms through exigent authority, a legal principle that permits execution of judgment when delay would endanger imperial interests. This authority, while rarely invoked, has been used to decapitate entire ruling classes. The most extreme example of this can be found in the cleansing of Balrog Minor during the late 38th millennia, where the entire planetary aristocracy was condemned by a 3-judge tribunal for failure to meet Adeptus Mechanicus requisition quotas. Within the structure of an Arbites precinct, personnel are divided into functional cadres. Patrol judges maintain public presence in areas under Imperial investigation. Executioners specialize in raids and arrests. Interrogators are assigned to extract confessions, often with the assistance of sanctioned pain induction devices. Data scribes oversee legal documentation, while justicars issue rulings based on codified law. Each of these roles is overseen by a precinct marshal, who in turn answers to a high justicar stationed at the sector or segmentum level. The command hierarchy is steep and uncompromising. Orders issued by a judge are legally binding. Disobeying one is considered sedition. Penitent blocks, however, are located in isolated facilities, underground vaults, orbital stations, or uninhabitable moons. Prisoners in these facilities are rarely released. Many serve as workforce in penal industries, while others are held in stasis until their usefulness to the Imperium can be determined. Conditions are harsh, but not chaotic. The goal is not cruelty, but strict, efficient control. One of the most heavily referenced multi-system judicial operations in the Administratum's late millennia 40 compliance records is the Centaur Convergence campaign, beginning in the year 251. The Centaur Convergence was a minor warp stable cluster within Segmentum Obscurus that had gradually fallen into a state of bureaucratic decay. Administratum supply routes reported conflicting tithing tallies, and several Forge worlds began logging material discrepancies in machine component shipments traced to the region. Arbites officials arrived with authorization from the Segmentum Tribunal and arrested 3 cardinals during live broadcasts. While the ecclesiarchy objected formally, documentation from the Grand Lex vaults indicates that the arrests were fully compliant with procedural code. The fallout of the Solvax case led to a significant rewrite of ecclesiarchal audit protocols and the establishment of semi-annual joint review sessions between Arbites liaisons and Ministorum treasurers. In Millennia 35, the Adeptus Arbites appeared in another high-profile case documented by both Administratum and Ecclesiarchy files, the Edicts of Fulgrim's Silence. This incident occurred on the shrine world of Solvax Quintus, where records indicated a discrepancy between pilgrim traffic, relic inventory, and ecclesiastical funding transfers. Administratum auditors, suspecting clerical error, launched a review that revealed no documentation for millions of thrones in donations. Prisons operated by the Adeptus Arbites are divided into 2 categories: temporary holding cells within precincts and penitent blocks for long-term detainment. The former are stark, cold rooms often located beneath court halls. Prisoners are fed nutrient paste and kept under continuous surveillance. Interrogations may be physical, psychic, or chemical, depending on the severity of the suspected offence. Through war, peace, or rebellion, the Adeptus Arbites endure. They do not fight for conquest or control. They do not represent ambition, ideology, or faith. They represent law. In a galaxy of shifting alliances and crumbling worlds, they are the final answer to disorder, the steady, unfeeling hand of judgment raised above the stars. Their purpose was not to serve planetary governors or local enforcers. It was not to maintain peace among citizens or oversee general criminality. The Arbites were established to enforce Imperial Law itself, an abstract monolithic body of edicts issued by the High Lords of Terra, the Adeptus Administratum, and the Lex Imperialis. The final evaluations of Millennia 41, filed in the Tertius Concordium report, list Arbites' presence as directly responsible for a 7% improvement in systemic administrative stability across the eastern fringe. Mechanicus published data from the Forge stronghold of Radax, cited in the same report, adds a similar figure, indicating that enforcement-related clarity allowed for over 900,000 worker cogitator hours to be reallocated from audit reconstruction to production tasks. Worlds abandoned by astropathic communication began appointing emergency regents, bypassing Imperial confirmation entirely. In response, those Arbites precincts still capable of warp travel initiated autonomous law mandates, an ancient emergency protocol that granted full judicial independence to Arbites High Justicars when contact with the Senatorum Imperialis was lost. Arbites squads were deployed without full briefing and conducted a by-the-book enforcement raid. All suspected heretics were arrested under standard civil violation charges, never realizing they had been part of an inquisitorial witch hunt. The Inquisitor later had the primary suspects extracted under transferal authority and classified the case as resolved. The Arbites were neither informed nor credited. Their role had been to make the Inquisition's work look like law. A particularly well-documented Arbites-led campaign occurred in the Veltraxian Confluence, a densely populated administrative node between Segmentum Tempestus and Ultima. Administratum records show that over 80 million citizens vanished from census logs in the first 17 years after the rift opened. The cause was initially thought to be attrition due to warp instability and Xenos predation. However, Arbites reconstitution units discovered an entirely separate pattern. Local governors had intentionally falsified death figures to mask illegal emigration, hoping to avoid imperial scrutiny over resource distribution. Arbites enforcement groups from nearby Calixis-based precincts launched targeted strikes across the Colonnar route. Administratum and Mechanicus observers were present for over 60% of the raids. Final judgment logs indicate that over 133 planetary officials were either executed or sentenced to penal servitude under Article 17 of the post-rift compliance mandate. Of particular note is the fact that Arbites officials filed 12 formal case templates from the operation into the Segmentum Lex archive, effectively updating regional enforcement doctrine. One such protocol, known informally as the Colonnar Accords, is now taught to all newly assigned Arbites liaison officers assigned to warp-fractured sectors. In the wake of the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Adeptus Arbites faced an existential test unlike any previously recorded. With the galaxy split in two by a rift of warp energy, systems across the Imperium found themselves severed from Terra, their tithe lines fragmented and their planetary command chains left isolated. Administratum records filed from Segmentum Pacificus in the first 50 years of the Great Rift event reveal a substantial increase in legal deviation, unauthorized succession, and complete administrative collapse. Adeptus Arbites officials arrived 3 weeks later aboard a Lex-flagged transport vessel. What followed became one of the most referenced joint operations in recorded Mechanicus history. Over 196 individuals, including Mechanicus-aligned scribes and a junior logis, were detained and tried under the Lex Imperialis. The Arbites compiled and returned a full prosecution archive within 17 days, an administrative record time. The Mechanicus later adopted part of the Arbites documentation template for internal purging procedures. As the imperial truth spread throughout the stars during the Great Crusade, so too did the need for an organization that could enforce compliance across countless worlds, especially when those worlds' rulers began to show signs of defiance or heresy. The result was a paramilitary quasi-judicial force bound directly to the Lex Imperialis and tasked with a single, unwavering duty: punish those who disobey the will of the Emperor as interpreted through the authority of Terra. One major example was the reconformity of Artex Magna, a hive world in Ultima Segmentum that had been severed from the Greater Imperium for over 90 years. Administratum tithing officials filed urgent petitions for Arbites review after contact was restored and found that Artex Magna had rewritten its legal hierarchy, establishing a theocratic republic in direct violation of Lex Imperialis. Arbites forces deployed with Crusade authorization and conducted mass arrest of the planetary legislature, then reimposed the original command hierarchy. Their justification was logged under Protocol 888, deviation of legal continuity. The post-action report cited over 4,000 executed officials and marked the event as a prime example of law restoration without cultural negotiation. Throughout the millennia 41 era, the frequency of such deployments only increased. Arbites records became a regular part of every major administratum sector review. Their presence was no longer limited to response actions, but integrated as a permanent legal watchdog in certain regions. Forge Worlds, in particular, began to preemptively include Arbites legal advisors in tithe projection councils and data vault construction protocols. This development signified a transition from reactive enforcement to preventative jurisdiction, a rare evolution in any branch of the Imperium. In year 110 of Millennia 41, the Atha compliance delay exposed a hidden failure cascade within Administratum cargo relay systems. Records show that nearly 100 freighter-class ships had disappeared from log with no secondary confirmation. The Mechanicus initially suspected machine logic corruption, but forensic data cracking by Arbites code scribes identified deliberate overwriting of ship departure tags. This was traced to a cluster of corrupted Vox-encoding tech priests who had been paid to hide smuggling operations. Arbites action was swift. 3 full precinct detachments deployed and captured the corrupted personnel, initiating a sweep of the Atha Route's entire trade network. In a sealed ruling transmitted directly to Mars and the Segmentum Tribunal chambers, the Arbites ordered destruction of the STC fragment. This ruling, though controversial, was upheld. Mechanicus archives report high tensions following the event, but later acknowledged the ruling had prevented further internal conflict. The event was archived as a legal deterrent example, an instance in which no party retained ownership, and the law itself became the deciding value. Arbites task forces, dispatched under Directive 49 Epsilon, initiated a rolling tribunal presence, one that allowed legal cases to be opened and judged while in transit between worlds. This was an innovation in procedural logistics, designed to eliminate downtime between deployments and reduce travel delays. Records indicate that over 3,400 legal cases were opened in the first 5 years of the campaign. Of these, 72% ended in execution, seizure of property, or nullification of hereditary planetary rights. The biology of an Arbites officer is not altered like the transhuman warriors of the Astartes, yet the physical and psychological conditioning they undergo creates a stark transformation. Recruits are drawn from Schola Progenium institutions, often selected for their unwavering discipline, analytical minds, and ruthless obedience. A standard Arbites enforcer stands between 175 and 190 centimeters in height, with musculature hardened through years of grueling training. As this chapter progresses further, the documented history continues to reveal the fundamental function of the Adeptus Arbites as stabilizing anchors. They were not designed for victory in war, nor for the management of cultures or ideologies. Their value, from the perspective of the Adeptus Administratum and Mechanicus, lies in their unwavering alignment to encoded structure. Wherever systems break, wherever tithes are misreported, and wherever law is threatened by complexity, the Arbites arrive not to solve but to impose resolution. The origins of the Adeptus Arbites reach back to the earliest days of the Imperium, when the Emperor first set out to impose order across the stars. Their creation, however, was not born out of conquest or idealism. It emerged instead from necessity, as the Imperium's rapid expansion demanded not only warriors but judges. The foundational roots of the Adeptus Arbites can be traced to the earliest bureaucratic structures of the Terran Unification Wars and the gradual formation of the Imperium's administrative core. Where the Emperor's Thunder Warriors had enforced dominance with brutality, and later the Space Marines with righteous fury, the Adeptus Arbites were designed to enforce law, not with ideology or flexibility, but with the iron-bound grip of unyielding imperial doctrine. Arbites' response was uncompromising. Deployment logs show that over 57 enforcement regiments were mobilized across Segmentum Tempestus alone. Records within the Administratum's Codex of Transitional Law show that legal compliance across the Imperium increased by over 9% within 2 decades of the reform's completion, a staggering success by imperial standards. The Adeptus Arbites maintain a strict code of personal discipline even outside operational deployments. Officers are required to observe vigil rotations, a tradition in which they spend several hours in complete silence, reviewing recorded casework from previous generations. This practice is intended to align present judgment with historic precedent. Physical conditioning is maintained through daily drills and regulated sparring. Use of combat stims, stimulants, or unsanctioned augmetics is strictly forbidden unless authorized by a marshal. Uniforms must be maintained to exact specifications, and any deviation from dress code is punishable under the Code of Internal Conduct. These rituals are enforced not by ideology, but by the belief that law must begin with the enforcer. Unlike the localized law enforcement of planetary PDF or civilian enforcer groups, the Adeptus Arbites maintain a completely different military doctrine. They do not patrol neighborhoods or respond to thefts. Their operations are surgical, often involving targeted raids against corrupt planetary officials, rogue administratum clerks, or traitorous nobles. Their tactics emphasize brutal precision, shock, and overwhelming force. Riot suppression formations are built around the use of suppression shields, shock mauls, and layered formations of non-lethal to lethal escalation. As the Imperium entered Millennia 42, the recorded footprint of the Adeptus Arbites was no longer confined to courtroom judgments or planetary raids. It had expanded into the arteries of bureaucratic life itself, an unyielding presence, not of adaptability but of structure, not innovators, not thinkers, but instruments that ensure all things, in the end, align with law. Administratum logs confirm that after the intervention, total trade route integrity for the sector increased by 24% within 2 years. Mechanicus reports submitted to Mars noted statistically abnormal recovery of function and cited Arbites enforcement as a primary factor. The event is archived within the Lex Mechanicum Integration Codex, Section 37. By the time of the Fourth Regulus Data Wars, the Arbites had become increasingly active in Mechanicus border space. These conflicts, taking place between rogue data enclaves, saw Arbites detachments requested to mediate claims over disputed STC fragments. The Mechanicus requested legal verification to determine custody over recovered data matter. While such arbitration was uncommon, the Lex Officio Inter Mechanica, formed just 1 century prior, was deemed an appropriate body to oversee the review. The Arbites confirmed the STC validity and ruled that both sides had violated Imperial protocols during their excavation operations. The behavioral tendencies of the Arbites, as noted in multiple Inquisition reports, follow a consistent psychological pattern. Procedural loyalty overrides moral subjectivity. This trait makes them resistant to chaos corruption, but simultaneously blinds them to larger strategic needs. Several Ordo Scriptorum profiles refer to Arbites personnel as informationally brittle, meaning that while their records are often immaculate, they lack internal flexibility when confronted with non-linear or metaphysical threats. Fair, known for having memorized over 90% of the Lex Imperialis, refused to grant planetary access until proper trial writs were filed for each temporal refugee. The Inquisitor ultimately bypassed him by declaring an Ordo override, but not before losing nearly 2 standard months of investigatory window. Fair was later reassigned. The document concludes with an unusual note from the overseeing Inquisitor. Law is not heresy, but it is not clarity either. The appearance of an Adeptus Arbites unit in full gear is a deliberate form of psychological warfare. Every component of their armour is intended to radiate authority. The dark carapace plating and gold accents create high contrast against most urban environments. The aquila displayed on the chestplate is oversized and elevated, signalling imperial authority above all. Helmets feature mirrored lenses that obscure the wearer's eyes, severing any personal connection. This dehumanization is intentional. The Arbites do not present themselves as individuals. They appear as faceless avatars of law. When deployed in formation, this visual impact becomes even more pronounced. Their synchronized movements, reinforced by vox-barked commands, produce an atmosphere of inevitability and dread. Their entire purpose becomes enforcing the Lex Imperialis, often with minimal regard for the morality or consequences of their actions. Once initiated, an Arbites officer rarely leaves the organization, and many die in service without ever seeing more than a handful of assignments. The weight of their duty is deliberately isolating. They are not made to question the system, they are made to execute it. Administratum and Mechanicus records across the final century of millennia, 41 and early millennia 42, continue to show a consistent trend. The Arbites operating less as emergency intervention forces and more as foundational components of sector governance. Data exchange logs confirm the presence of permanent Arbites observers embedded in administratum planning councils across all 5 segmentum capitals. In fact, the Lextral Integration Doctrine, signed in year 4211, formalized this status, granting Arbites precincts standing access to in-progress legislative adjustments before their full ratification. Both factions submitted formal protestations to the Administratum Central Chamber. The matter was resolved when the Arbites presented chronological documentation proving the legal priority of their case file submission by 12 standard hours. The Mechanicus conceded. Though tensions remained, this case is often cited by Arbites officials as precedent for interdepartmental legal sequencing, demonstrating that law, when properly filed, overrides even omnissiah protocol. Their weight typically falls between 80 and 100 kilograms, with considerable muscle density due to the extensive combat drills and load-bearing gear. Their hair is often shaved or kept in regulation close-cropped styles. Most have scars from training, brawls, or punishments inflicted during their instruction. Their skin tone varies depending on origin world, but is frequently pale from long periods spent indoors or in void habitats. Arbites are not bred for warmth or approachability. Their presence is meant to inspire compliance through intimidation and the implied threat of violence. A typical Adeptus Arbites precinct fortress is a brutalist structure of ferrocrete and adamantine. Often situated in or above a hive city's upper levels, it serves both as a prison and a deployment base. Within these fortresses are interrogation chambers, armories, law codices stored in endless vaults, and training yards. Arbites officers sleep in barrack cells, eat in silence, and spend their off-duty hours studying case law or rehearsing drills. There is no recreation. There is no leniency. Every aspect of their lifestyle reinforces their disconnection from the civilian world and their absolute loyalty to the Imperium's law. However, in most cases, the Arbites do not use non-lethal options at all, because their targets are not citizens but enemies of the state. For wider engagements or during planet-wide breakdowns of order, they deploy with support from armoured vehicles such as repressors and specialised riot tanks, often accompanied by cyber mastiffs or servo skulls used for reconnaissance and psychological intimidation. Socially, the Adeptus Arbites function as a caste entirely separate from any planetary culture. They do not marry, do not form families, and rarely engage in social interactions outside of their own precinct fortresses. Their culture is monastic, centered on law, obedience, and ritualistic drills. Their core values are severity, detachment, and judgment. Promotions are based entirely on merit, adherence to doctrine, and the successful execution of assignments, not on charisma, seniority, or popularity. Their chain of command is rigid and unbreakable, with judges at the top interpreting and executing orders from the central Lex offices of Terra. Famous figures among the Adeptus Arbites are few, largely due to the organization's collective identity and disdain for individual fame. However, there are exceptions. Judge Zephon of Decilium was known for purging half the ruling houses of his planet after uncovering a network of heretical administratum clerks. Marshal Varro Rask led an interplanetary task force during the Masrax insurrection, personally executing 17 planetary governors found guilty of sedition. Perhaps the most legendary figure is High Justica Vendelin, whose interpretation of the Lex Imperialis became the basis for updated Arbites field protocols across Segmentum Obscurus during the early years of Millennia 39. During the years immediately following the Horus heresy, the Arbites saw a sharp increase in power and scope. The Imperium had nearly fractured under internal betrayal, and many of the traitorous cells had originated from within high-ranking Imperial institutions. The High Lords of Terra responded by expanding the jurisdiction of the Arbites, empowering them to act not only against planetary governors, but also against members of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Administratum, and even ecclesiarchy personnel, provided sufficient legal justification could be produced. This increase in authority gave rise to the feared role of the Investigatus Primus, a rank granted to Arbites officers tasked with investigating suspected heresy or sedition at the uppermost levels of Imperial society. The gear used by the Adeptus Arbites reflects their purpose and psychological doctrine. The most iconic element is the carapace armour, coloured in black or dark steel with gold Aquila insignias. It is reinforced to withstand both melee impacts and low to mid-caliber firearms, providing them with excellent durability in close quarters combat. Their helmets often include built-in vox communication, infrared vision, and voice projection systems to issue commands across riot lines. This legal absolutism is further reinforced during their professional development. Arbites cadets spend years studying vast tomes of Imperial Law, case studies of sedition, and procedural manuals for planetary audits. They memorize entire volumes of the Lex Imperialis and are regularly tested on obscure rulings dating back tens of thousands of years. Practical training includes simulated riot control in zero gravity, endurance conditioning under deprivation, and hand-to-hand combat with live opponents. Punishments for failure are harsh and immediate. Many cadets do not survive. Those who do emerge with a mindset that prioritizes legal clarity over personal conviction. Once deployed, they're expected to act with complete autonomy, guided only by law and sanctioned orders. They wield combat shotguns loaded with various shell types, suppression mauls, shock batons, and bolt pistols depending on mission parameters. Specialist units may carry grenade launchers, heavy stubbers, or flamers. Their vehicles, such as the Repressor, are reinforced with plasteel plating and often outfitted with loudspeakers for psychological warfare, alongside water cannons or chemical dispersers for riot suppression. Philosophically, the Arbites see themselves as both executioners and protectors of Imperial civilization. Their outlook is not concerned with compassion or diplomacy. They believe that the law must be enforced uniformly, regardless of circumstance. Mercy is not within their jurisdiction. An Arbites officer who hesitates to execute a corrupt planetary governor is just as guilty of heresy as the governor himself. This inflexible worldview is what makes them both feared and respected. Entire planetary populations may rise in rebellion upon hearing the Arbites are en route to investigate. Others see them as last resort saviors in a sea of corruption. Behaviorally, Arbites officers exhibit high degrees of emotional suppression. Their instincts are trained toward escalation rather than de-escalation. They assess threats quickly and respond with overwhelming force. There is no allowance for uncertainty or compromise. In moments of conflict, their movements are clinical and deliberate, often shaped by years of standardized engagement drills. Arbites are not prone to fear, empathy, or indecision. Their training extinguishes such responses in favor of calculated legal execution. Their logistics are simple yet unrelenting. Arbites units do not rely on local infrastructure. They bring their own supplies, their own transport, and their own authority. Planetary governors are expected to accommodate them, but cannot command them. The presence of an Arbites detachment is often a sign of Imperial scrutiny, and few dare to interfere. Arbites are capable of remaining operational for extended campaigns, utilizing secure supply chains routed directly through Adeptus Administratum channels. In rare cases, they will request aid from nearby Space Marine chapters or Astra Militarum regiments, but only when their mission aligns with broader Imperial goals. Where necessary, they conducted judicial purges. If a planetary leader was found guilty of deviating from the Lex Imperialis, the Arbites would execute judgment without regard for local customs, political relationships, or planetary traditions. This lack of flexibility often generated friction between Imperial governors and Arbites detachments. Over time, however, it was accepted as a cost of being under Imperial rule. While most Arbites precincts are based on major worlds, certain types of assignments require mobile enforcement groups. These groups operate out of Arbites Void transports, heavily armoured spacecraft capable of transporting full enforcement regiments across systems. These ships are equipped with prison cells, briefing chambers, and deployment bays. Arbites vessels rarely enter planetary atmospheres except during full-scale intervention. When they do, they release dropships and armoured carriers, often under the cover of Imperial sanction documents transmitted ahead of arrival. Local rulers are given no choice in accepting their presence. The law is not negotiated, it is imposed. While the Adeptus Arbites are often associated with urban enforcement actions, such as suppressing hive riots or arresting rogue clerks, their deployment scale extends far beyond single-world engagements. On numerous occasions, the Arbites have led sector-wide investigations. These operations can last for decades and often involve coordination with other branches of the Imperium, though never subordination to them. In such campaigns, the Arbites function as both legal auditors and combat commanders. They review planetary records, interrogate officials, and issue judgments that can result in mass executions, government collapses, or even exterminatus recommendations. Such is their legal reach that their reports often become formal charges in the Senatorium Imperialis itself. Their suppression mauls, while primitive in appearance, incorporate shock capacitors capable of disabling targets wearing power armor. Their vehicles emphasize function over aesthetics. The Repressor, for example, is a heavily armored personnel carrier with sloped armor, frontal flamers, and portside firing slits. It lacks the elegance of an Astartes Rhino, but compensates with internal detention bays, riot foam dispensers, and wide deployment hatches designed for rapid breaching. Technology used by the Adeptus Arbites is not advanced in a mechanical sense, but rather in its refinement for specific functions. Shotguns used by Arbites units are not ornate or complex, but they are built for extreme durability, reliability, and firepower. Standard issue ammunition includes man-stopper rounds, high-penetration slugs, and chemical dispersal shells. Among the more specialized functions within the Adeptus Arbites are the proctors and judicial investigators. These officers are deployed for long-term operations in which a world, sector, or particular individual requires sustained legal observation. They do not act immediately upon arrival, nor do they reveal their presence unless necessary. Instead, they collect records, interview administratum staff, cross-reference tithing reports, and monitor planetary compliance with imperial edicts. The Adeptus Arbites, by contrast, have no interest in such infractions, unless they intersect with imperial law. They do not enforce local curfews or investigate petty crime. They intervene only when actions violate the Lex Imperialis or pose a threat to the broader stability of the Imperium. In practice, this means that an Arbites officer may ignore mass protests, civil violence, or unrest, unless those actions interfere with tithes, administratum functions, or governance mandates from Terra. Through all of this, one truth remains consistent. The Adeptus Arbites are not a defensive force, not a peacekeeping force, and not an investigative agency in the civilian sense. They are instruments of compliance. Their mission is not to protect people, but to uphold the rule of law as defined by the Imperium. Whether that law is fair, just, or righteous is irrelevant. Their duty is not to question the law. Their duty is to enforce it, without hesitation, without remorse, and without exception. Within their internal hierarchy, few conflicts exist. The nature of Arbites training eliminates ambition as a motive. Officers do not seek promotion for personal gain. They rise through ranks only as their legal mastery and execution record demand. Political intrigue is virtually non-existent. The primary source of internal review comes from higher precincts or Terra itself, where legal auditors examine casework for deviation from imperial doctrine. In rare cases where corruption is discovered within the Arbites, those responsible are executed immediately. The legal principle is simple: a corrupted enforcer is the gravest betrayal of all. Their assignments often span decades. Some are embedded deep within planetary bureaucracies under assumed identities, carrying full authority to act when legal thresholds are crossed. When the order is finally given, they emerge with full case documentation and the right to conduct arrests, trials, or summary executions as required. The Arbites arrived and immediately enforced a data moratorium, freezing all transactions, identity verifications, and population quotas until a verified reconstruction could be legally ratified. Using backup records from outer system Mechanicus data nodes and corroborated administratum registries, the Arbites manually rebuilt the core census files. This process took 9 years. Though not an enforcement operation, the presence of the Arbites was critical in ensuring that the planetary leadership did not falsify reconstruction data. Their final report certified the restored records as Lex conformant. The Mechanicus would later adopt the Arbites formatting structure for emergency data loss recovery protocols. The distinction between the Adeptus Arbites and the more commonly recognized planetary enforcers is critical. Enforcers are local police forces, raised and operated by planetary governments. They maintain day-to-day civil order, handling theft, assault, property disputes, and similar infractions. They are beholden to local customs, regional policies, and the authority of planetary governors. The accused is either summoned, arrested, or, in cases involving higher security clearance, executed on site. Trials are brief, often lasting under 1 hour, and conducted without defense representation. The verdict is final. Appeals are forbidden unless ordered directly from Terra. Punishments include incarceration, labor sentences, sterilization, memory cleansing, or execution, depending on severity and context. Arbites justice is not designed to rehabilitate. It is designed to remove threats. Judicial procedures within Arbites precincts are standardized across the Imperium. When a suspected violation is reported or discovered, Arbites investigators begin a case record. Evidence is collected through sanctioned data scribe channels, interrogations, and material forensics. Witnesses, if applicable, are detained and evaluated. Once sufficient evidence is compiled, a judge reviews the case file and issues a writ of action. Cybernetic enhancement within the Arbites is regulated and primarily limited to repair of combat injuries. Full-body reconstruction or neural reprogramming is not standard. However, some precincts maintain Lex Officiates, servitor-like functionaries built from condemned heretics. These beings serve as living databanks or law reciters, repeating imperial edicts continuously in public areas. Their presence is meant both to educate and to terrorize. Lex Officiates often speak in multi-layered vox tones and are programmed to interrupt public gatherings with doctrinal corrections. They are not considered sapient, and their suffering is viewed as legally resolved. In systems where Arbites presence is newly established or met with hostility, they may deploy Pax Mandators, mobile legal units used to stabilize hostile environments. These teams combine riot suppression squads, judges, and data scribes. Their primary function is to assess whether local enforcers can be trusted with continued jurisdiction, or whether direct imperial enforcement must be established. In cases where mandators determine local forces are compromised, enforcers are relieved of duty, disarmed, and subjected to loyalty tests. If found wanting, executions are carried out in public to reinforce imperial supremacy. Arbites engagements with Xenos threats are rare, as their jurisdiction lies with human lawbreakers, not alien invaders. However, there are recorded cases of Arbites detachments fighting in war zones when planetary collapse demanded their involvement. During the Orc invasions of Norum Prime, Arbites squads maintained control of key administratum archives, preventing the loss of valuable tithing records, even as Astartes and Astra Militarum forces were routed. In the face of Tyrannid incursions, Arbites have held out in isolated fortresses until relief arrived, often surviving through meticulous rationing and heavily restricted access protocols. Their resilience is not born of tactical genius or battlefield superiority, but of unshakable procedure and refusal to surrender. Communication between Arbites precincts is managed through the lexicon relays, encrypted data links maintained by Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests under legal obligation. These relays carry legal updates, new edicts, and priority alerts from Terra. Judges are required to confirm receipt and implementation of each transmission, and failure to do so may result in audit. During periods of warp storm or communication breakdown, precincts revert to archived legal doctrine, operating as autonomous legal units until contact is restored. This independence ensures that even in total isolation, Arbites forces continue to function. The personal lives of Arbites officers are tightly restricted. They are not permitted to form romantic relationships, possess personal wealth, or engage in unsanctioned communication with planetary inhabitants. Meals are regulated, recreation is non-existent, and most precincts enforce silence during off-duty hours. The only personal items allowed are legal texts or devotional medallions inscribed with the Emperor's judicial seal. Emotional expression is discouraged outside of legal rhetoric. This suppression is not considered cruelty, it is policy. Emotion clouds judgment. Law requires clarity. Arbites enforcement regiments arrived and executed a full purge of the ruling class, installing temporary civil governors under direct Adeptus oversight. For 3 decades following, Halberd's fall saw near-perfect compliance, and Mechanicus data flow records confirmed substantial improvements in Forge World supply chains tied to that region. The event remains a teaching module within multiple legal archives on Terra, recorded as Codex Judicium 88X. The architectural style of Arbites facilities mirrors their organizational ethos. Most precinct fortresses are built in the Brutalist Sanctum style, characterized by massive vertical pillars, recessed weapon emplacements, and reinforced blast gates. Interiors are Spartan, exposed ferrocrete, lumen strips, and steel-grated flooring. The atmosphere is sterile, controlled, and intentionally devoid of comfort. Offices are narrow, weapons lockers are marked with legal citations, and court halls are dominated by oversized Aquilas and legal inscriptions. Every design element reinforces the presence of Imperial Law as supreme authority. Near the end of Millennia 38, the Malfi Compromise was drafted. This administrative doctrine, authored jointly by Arbites High Justicars and senior scribes of the Administratum, formalized Arbites access to certain sealed records when criminal implications were suspected. The compromise was forged after the trial of Orbiter Secundus, a case in which Administratum officials were found to have falsified death reports to continue drawing tithes from a depopulated agri-world. The Arbites flagged several Administratum nodes within the Yaran subsector for quota manipulation and logistical deviation. Over the course of 8 standard years, a rotating judgment barge squad moved from system to system, removing planetary governors and executing Administratum officials found guilty of falsifying Forge World requisitions. The official report presented to the High Lords of Terra concluded with a statement that has since been widely quoted in Arbites academies: "Law does not answer to delay, only to resolve." Across the Imperium, reactions to the Arbites vary. Some worlds fear their arrival as a sign of pending purges. Others welcome them as incorruptible enforcers against local tyranny. In rare cases, planetary rulers attempt to manipulate or bribe Arbites detachments, only to face execution for attempting to corrupt imperial authority. While few citizens understand the full scope of the Lex Imperialis, all know that when the black-armoured judges arrive, it is not for debate, it is to render sentence. Not all records involve criminality or treason. Several Administratum and Mechanicus case files show Arbites involvement in restoration and emergency stabilization. During the data rift collapse of Panel 5 in year 364, the central data archives of the hive-spanning city collapsed due to tectonic shift and storage overload. Tens of thousands of records were lost, including tithe schedules, population registries, and Mechanicus technology records. The planetary governor requested emergency assistance from the Adeptus Mechanicus, which in turn escalated to the Arbites when multiple conflicting reconstruction reports emerged. In the final legal review of Millennia 41, the Pan-Segmentum Judiciary Index declared the Adeptus Arbites an essential procedural entity, a phrase previously reserved only for the Administratum itself. For the first time in recorded history, the lawgivers were not separate from the machine of administration, they were part of it. Despite this tension, Arbites personnel are occasionally used as blunt instruments by the Inquisition. When a visible enforcement presence is required to legitimize an otherwise extra-legal action, Inquisitors may redirect Arbites forces through misrepresented judicial protocols. The Ordo Hereticus document codenamed Silence Dagger, dated to year 804 of Millennia 38, describes a false corruption audit initiated by an Inquisitor to root out a potential psychocult embedded in a hive's lower strata. In the last decades of Millennia 41, the Strikon failings came under wide investigation. This event, well known among Administratum records clerks, involved a complex web of quota mismanagement, planet-class misreporting, and serial forgery of psycho-registration documents. The Arbites intervention, logged in year 908, began with a review of refugee ship manifestos. A single cross referenced identity mismatch between astropathic reports and on-world census led Arbites agents to uncover an entirely falsified planetary tithing structure. Dozens of worlds in the Strikon subsector were involved. Administratum records indicate the falsifications had persisted for over 170 years before discovery. Within 6 months, the Arbites identified and arrested 3 high-ranking officials from both Mechanicus and civilian administrative departments. All were later executed following confirmed confession and cross-verified data interrogation. The subsequent review process implemented automated timestamping procedures across thousands of Forge worlds, an innovation credited directly to Arbites forensic procedures. Administratum policy was amended shortly after, requiring external legal observers for all Tier 2 vault access operations. The incident stands as a turning point in procedural security and the lasting influence of Arbites protocol on wider Imperial systems. Throughout the next several centuries, Arbites deployment logs, housed within the primary data stacks of the Adeptus Administratum, show a trend of increased use of mobile judgment barges. These void-capable vessels allowed the Arbites to conduct multi-system operations, bypassing planetary defense networks and intervening directly in legal violations that crossed interstellar jurisdiction. The Aran subsector cleansing, recorded in the year 279 of Millennia 36, was one such campaign. As the Imperium entered the final centuries of Millennia 41, Arbites' presence remained consistent but under ever-increasing strain. Administratum reports began to show longer case file completion times, decreased full sector coverage, and backlog accumulation. Arbites precincts were stretched thin as the Imperium's administrative workload reached unsustainable levels. During Millennia 37, Arbites documentation expands further, including increased references to exemplar enforcia, a record category used to designate case studies in ideal enforcement. One of the most prominent entries of this era is the Censure of Halberd's Fall, wherein Arbites squads intervened on a feudal world after administratum audits revealed that tithe schedules were falsified to favour the local nobility. Arbites operatives uncovered that imperial shipments were being redirected to personal warbands. By the dawn of Millennia 38, Arbites involvement in Adeptus Mechanicus matters had grown more contentious. The Luthen Delta dispute stands out as a rare example of jurisdictional overlap that nearly escalated into armed conflict. A Mechanicus exploratory fleet reported suspected Xenos infiltration within a mining colony. Arbites forces, already present for a separate judicial review of trade documentation, refused to evacuate. What they discovered was a widespread civilian resistance network funded by diverted tech ministry assets. With Mechanicus approval, the Arbites conducted multiple targeted strikes across the hive's middle strata. Arrests numbered in the tens of thousands, and seizure of records enabled the Adeptus Mechanicus to trace further corruption across 5 neighbouring systems. The final report, documented jointly, was submitted as part of the Segmentum Grand Tribunal review, with Arbites analysis cited for forensic efficiency and precision documentation. Arbites inquiries had been delayed for years due to sealed sector-level clearance protocols. The trial, when finally authorised, resulted in the mass execution of over 300 administratum workers. Following the trial, the compromise was enacted, giving Arbites direct review access to audit sensitive datasets under conditions of authorised suspicion. This adjustment to bureaucratic law was recorded as a landmark evolution in intra-imperial cooperation. The Arbites responded by deploying 2 judgment barges and establishing planetary courts on Helicon Secundus and Tertius. Documentation recovered from the Lex Vault on Terra indicates that 72 administrators were formally tried and executed. In a rare joint declaration, both the Arbites and the Fabricator General of Helicon stated that synchronization of law and logic had been successfully achieved. The Helicon Protocol remains a foundational part of Mechanicus Arbites liaison doctrine to this day. By the beginning of Millennia 39, Adeptus Arbites deployment records show a significant spike in joint operations with the Adeptus Mechanicus. One of the most widely archived examples is the compliance review of Hive Dominata, a spire world in the Segmentum Pacificus. Arbites records indicate they arrived to investigate mass shortages of Mechanicus calibrated control gel, an essential export used in reactor stabilization. Yet despite this, enforcement statistics remained steady in key regions, particularly those where the High Judiciary Concord, signed in the year 773, had been enacted. This concord allowed Arbites forces to preemptively deploy into disputed systems without waiting for full administrative authorization. It was considered a necessary compromise by most high-level scribes, given the increasing frequency of internal collapse. Another significant milestone came during the reformation of the Lex Codifica, a wide-scale review of outdated Imperial Law conducted in the early centuries of Millennia 40. The Adeptus Arbites served as primary enforcers during the transitional period, ensuring that administrators across the Imperium properly implemented the updated legal frameworks. Several planetary governors resisted, citing regional stability concerns. Administratum strategists argue that such integration was necessary. By the close of Millennia 41, tithing errors, data loss, and unauthorized governance transfers had reached critical mass in multiple systems. The Arbites were not merely enforcing law, they had become part of the information ecology itself. Every sealed report, every recalculated tithe, and every authorized removal of a rogue planetary governor was documented and filed by an Arbites scribe judge. Another illustrative case recorded in both Mechanicus and Administratum archives is the Vault Fire incident on the Shrine Forge world of Kasserine. In year 795 of Millennia 40, an explosive chain reaction destroyed several subsector data vaults, causing catastrophic record loss of tithing data, local judicial codes, and Mechanicus research logs. Preliminary investigations by the Mechanicus suspected sabotage, but data tracing was inconclusive. Arbites specialists arrived 3 months later and initiated a full legal lockdown of the planetary vault network. A review of the surviving Lex Factorum logs uncovered altered timestamps and misaligned tithe synchronizations, clear evidence of deliberate tampering. In the eastern reaches of Segmentum Ultima, a distinct legal precedent was established during the Colonnar transit seizures, where post-Rift shipping convoys began disappearing en route to Keyforge planets. The Mechanicus initially theorized warp drift or Eldar raiding patterns, but recovered black box Vox transcripts, decoded by Arbites cryptologians, revealed that certain rogue planetary officials had redirected shipping manifests to unmarked coordinates in exchange for protection from local pirate fleets. These violations crossed multiple legal boundaries, including breach of tithe protocol, conspiracy against sanctioned trade, and failure to report Xenos negotiations. Administratum scribes praised the campaign's efficiency. In particular, Segmentum-level High Scribe Elidrus recorded in his review that the Arbites had demonstrated a perfect application of bureaucratic justice scaled to macroeconomic collapse. The Arbites themselves issued no public commentary on the results. Their only post-action documentation was a procedural debriefing, sealed with the Lex Imperialis and filed to the Orbital Codicium for audit preservation. The Centaur convergence is still referenced in contemporary legal case law as a precedent for interplanetary mass judgment. In Millennia 40, year 611, a high-profile suppression was recorded in the Forge cluster of Helican Delta, located on the rimward edge of Segmentum Solar. The Mechanicus petitioned for Arbites intervention after discovering that a number of Forge barons had altered tithe cycles by forging astropathic confirmations of shipment dispatch. The Adeptus Mechanicus had already launched a partial internal purge, but lacked legal authority to execute non-tech adept administrators. The recruitment process for the Arbites begins with psychometric profiling conducted at the Schola Progenium, where orphans of imperial servants are educated under the harsh rule of ecclesiarchal tutors. Only the most obedient, logical, and emotionally unyielding students are recommended for Arbites candidacy. These individuals are then subjected to years of further psychological hardening, legal indoctrination, and brutal physical training.